Hi everyone, today we're going to be telling you about my bird collection. So please enjoy your favorite videos on YouTube and let's have things to write below and let's just start the video on all of my special birds that I have. This is a special pet birds to see right at it. Our first one is Ishi, and Ishi is a red black head one with the yellow one, you see, and so crazy. Our next is Elo, and Elo was a golden sparrow, like that you see, and she will get. Our next is Elmo. Elmo was a blue sparrow, like that you see, and she is it. Our next is Bisty, and Bisty is a chestnut sparrow, and we'll get to next. Our next is Colette, and Colette was a bird sparrow, like a bird when it has it. Our next is Vicky, and Vicky is a great one with the backguards and he. Our next is Greenie, and Greenie is a parrot finch, and so like. Our next is Bluey, and Bluey was a bluebell finch. Our next is Kitty, and Kitty was a very special black finch or something. This is Shaggy, and Shaggy is the black finch of the shield. Our next is Coco, and Coco is a black and white mannequin with the strongest beak. Our next is Burford, and Burford is a black-faced purple breast folding. Our next is Vicky, and Vicky was a Java finch that I got from Petco that I didn't see. Our next is Kissy, and Kissy was a finch with brown mask from there too. Our next is Treaty, and Treaty is a tricolored finch like that. Our next is Snowbag, and Snowbag is a white zebra finch that I ordered from the pet shop. Our next is Kosu, and Kosu was a beautiful firetail finch. Our next is Honey, and Honey was a red-faced sparrow or something. Our next is Bluey, and Bluey was a parrotdill. Let's see. Our next is Auntie, and Auntie was a woody. I don't know what that person. Our next is Cinderella, and Cinderella was a wax-beal species. Look. Our next is Cordon, and Cordon was a red-cheeked cordon blue. Our next is Costo, and Costo was a titmouse with his. Our next is Hebu, and Hebu was a Palawan titmouse. Our next is Kirsty, and Kirsty was is an. Our next is Tiny, and Tiny was a Taiwan titmouse. Our next is Questy, and Questy was a black tit with. Our next is Laura, and Laura was a black lord titmouse. Our next is Kitty, and Kitty was a. I'd read another one. Our next is Bistu, and Bistu was a willow finch or something else. Our next is Coturni, and Coturni was a tit with a black and white feathers on it. Our next is Ketule, and Ketule was a black crested tit with yellow plumage on. Our next is Papago, and Papago was a sultan tit that I got from the zoo pet shop. Our next is Kiste, and Kiste was a. Our next is Pity, and Pity was a crested tit. Our next is Katua, and Katua was a hooded warbler. Our next is Scarlet, and Scarlet is a red warbler. Our next is Proton, and Proton is a yellow-head warbler with the green plumage. Our next is Flimmy, and Flimmy was a fire-tail. Our next is Suseti, and Suseti is a. Our next is Mitty, and Mitty was a rufous warbler. Our this one is Savuya, and Savuya was a sunbird with green blue. Our next is Desmo, and Desmo was a colored sunbird. Our next is Peewee, and Peewee is a sparkly-headed sunbird like that. Our next is Bushy, and Bushy was a younger colored. Our next is Churi, and Churi was a olive sunbird. Right? Our next is Longy, and Longy was a green tails. Our next is Fanny, and Fanny was a brown fantail. Our next is Blackie, and Blackie was a black fantail, and this is so cute. Our next is Spotty, and Spotty is a ticket fantail. Our next is Ritty, and Ritty was I don't know. Our next is Blendy, and Blendy was a our next is Bluegee, and Bluegee was a Mindanao fantail. Our next is Katuri, and Katuri was a black skin. Our next is Cotonia, and Cotonia was a our next is Dippy, and Dippy was a Chlorophornia bird. Let's see. Our next is Petuni, and Petuni was a our next is Flower, and Flower was a Luna Chlorophornia. Our next is Cotus, and Cotus was a our next is Wavy, and Wavy was a indigo bunting. Our next is Katasi, and Katasi was a bunting grosbeak. Our next is Beaky, and Beaky was a grosbeak. Our next is Sungold, and Sungold was a yellow grosbeak. Our next is Mastuna, and Mastuna was a female biscuit bunting grosbeak. Our next is Songbird, and he's a red canary when here. Our next is Chrissy, and Chrissy was a summer tanager. Our next is Batuno, and Batuno was a azure tanager when we. Our next is Bolwood, and Bolwood was a big head tanager. Our next is Honeybee, and Honeybee was a tanager. Our next is Beachy, and Beachy was a blue. Our next is Summer, and Summer was a black-faced Daphne's bird. Let's see. Our next is Chicken, and Chicken is a green female bird. Our next is Indigo, and Indigo is a black tanager here. Our next is Sparkles, and Sparkles was a blue-headed one. Our next is Asato, and Asato was a green and blue one. Our next is Etoko, and Etoko was let's see. Our next is Brassy, and Brassy was a brassy-breasted tanager bird. Yes. Our next is Rainbow, and Rainbow is a chestnut-backed. Our next is Collie, and Collie was a coal crest or something. Our next is Gold, and Gold is a golden tanager. Our next is Satuna, and Satuna was a. Our next is Kisaki, and Kisaki was a emerald tanager. Our next is Grassy, and Grassy was a grass green tanager. Our next is Superbird, and Superbird is a brown and blue tanager one. Our next is Katuna, and Katuna was a dot. Our next is Victor, and Victor was a gilt-edged tanager bird one. Our next is Satuka, and Satuka was a golden one. Our next is Sunlight, and he's a golden one. Our next is Monuna, and Monuna was a green honey creeper. Our next is Stoneki, and Stoneki was a green and gold tanager bird when we had. Our next is Honuna, and Honuna was a buff vernice. Our next is Kusi, and Kusi was a golden unicorn. Our next is Kitawan, and Kitawan was a golden chevron tanager ganavare. Our next is Kosavani, and Kosavani was a green tanager baravage. Our next is Kokuta, and Kokuta was a green-headed tanager baravage. Our next is Sato, and Sato was a golden-headed tanager baravage. Our next is Costura, and Costura was a metallic green tanager bandare. Our next is Rainbow Rush, and Rainbow Rush was a multicolored tanager bandare. Our next is Hohuno, and Hohuno was a opal brown tanager bandare. Our next is Kiati, and Kiati was a orange eared tanager bandare. Our next is Paradise, and Paradise was a paradise tanager. Our next is Basukura, and Basukura was I don't know what it means. Our next is Kista, and Kista was a red crested cardinal badabagare. Our next is Shine, and Shine was a red electronic river runare. Our next is Kidene, and Kidene was a red naked sandal. Our next is Stino, and Stino was I don't know. Our next is Kebi, and Kebi was a. Our next is Panama, and Panama was a scarlet dyed tanager. Our next is Septin, and Septin was a 7-colored tanager. Our next is Silton, and Silton was a silvery throated. Our next is Spitty, and Spitty was a. Our next is Kitty, and Kitty was a. Our next is Mandungi, and Mandungi was a. Our next is Dotkin, and Dotkin was a spotted tanager. Our next is Kesuka, and Kesuka was a. Our next is Streaky, and Streaky was a street tanager. Our next is Parastu, and Parastu was a female swallow tanager. Our next is Kosonani, and Kosonani was a teat like tanager. Our next is Hontu, and Hontu was a turquoise tanager. Our next is Vermilion, and Vermilion was a vermilion tanager. Our next is Masky, and Masky was I don't know. Our next is Canelli, and Canelli was a white throated tanager. Our next is Snowcap, and Snowcap was a white cat tanager. Our next is Minduna, and Minduna was a yellow belly tanager. Our next is Kistura, and Kistura was a yellow scalp tanager. Our next is Kenur, and Kenur was a yellow. Our next is Scoppy, and Scoppy was a black bat. Our next is Stimundi, and Stimundi was a green mannequin. Our next is Celine, and Celine was a small cat mannequin. Our next is Minduni, and Minduni was a beard. Our next is Condor, and Condor was a white cat mannequin. Our next is Mizura, and Mizura was a round-tail mannequin. Our next is Black Spot, and Black Spot was a black mannequin. Our next is Bashiri, and Bashiri was a right mannequin. Our next is Wiretail, and Wiretail was a wiretail mannequin. Our next is Quadrite, and Quadrite was a sporty spotted pattern. Our next is Turquoise, and Turquoise was a fairy flagon. Our next is Screamer, and Screamer was a screaming peacock. Our next is Leafy, and Leafy is a greater green leaf bird. Our next is Ringlet, and Ringlet was a ring kingfisher. Our next is Hondini, and Houdini was a rapture. Our next is Marine, and Marine was an ultramarine kingfisher. Our next is Biak, and Biak was a Biak paradise kingfisher. Our next is Buru, and Buru was a buff-breasted paradise kingfisher. Our next is Kusura, and Kusura was a I don't remember. Our next is Nonfur, and Nonfur was a Nonfur paradise kingfisher. Our next is magpie, and magpie was a pie kingfisher. Our next is Usure. Usure was a green kingfisher. Our next is forest, and forest was a green. Our next is Kotawa, and Kotawa was a something kingfisher. Our next is link, and link was a boo link for the. Our next is honeybun, and honeybun was a. Our next is singer, and singer was a Venezuelan tropioma. Right? Our next is basuco, and basuco was a. I don't remember. Our next is kisula, and kisula was a tropio or something. Our next is Christy, and Christy was a. I don't know. Our next is JB, and JB was the green JB. Our next is juniper, and juniper was the last crested JB. Our next is Kochowa, Kochowa was a green Kochowa. Our next is Honda, and Honda was a backed by J. Our next is Groovy, and Groovy was a Grandala Thrush. Our next is Emerald, and Emerald was a green magpie. Our next is Jade, and Jade was an Indo-Chinese green magpie. Our next is Palmy, and Palmy was a Java green magpie. Up next is Paley, and Paley was a Bonnie and green magpie. These are my parrots. This is Pluto. Our next is Haru. Our next is Groundling. Our next is Midnight. Our next is Bunduro. Our next is Sunset. Our next is Prince Charm. Our next is Flint. Our next is Polly. Our next is Buduke. Our next is Stonori. And our last one is Ringneck. 177 birds are in my aviary room tour, and please subscribe to your channel and then I can comment below, and thank you for watching. Bye.